Admiral Harrison checked her watch with the mechanical precision of someone whose professional life had been measured in mission deadlines for more years than most officers served in their entire careers. The experimental aircraft will be ready for launch in 16 hours. That gives us time for final mission planning, equipment preparation, and intelligence updates on the target area. Morrison found himself contemplating the surreal speed with which theoretical discussions about classified assignments had transformed into operational reality. Less than 24 hours ago, he had been conducting routine pilot evaluations for Top Gun certification. Now, he was witnessing the final preparations for a mission that could determine the fate of hundreds of innocent civilians while potentially preventing an intelligence catastrophe that could compromise American operations around the world. The briefing room began to empty as various participants departed to handle their respective responsibilities for mission preparation, leaving Morrison alone with nightfall and the weight of secrets that felt heavier than an aircraft carrier's anchor chain. The woman who stood before him bore the standard patches and insignia of a naval aviator, but her presence carried the unmistakable aura of someone who had accepted responsibilities that extended far beyond conventional military service. "Lieutenant Commander," Morrison said, his voice carrying the concern of someone who had spent 30 years watching exceptional officers face impossible choices, "I want you to know that regardless of what happens during this mission, your performance at Top Gun today was the most impressive display of airmanship I've witnessed in my entire career. You've redefined my understanding of what individual pilots can accomplish when they possess the right combination of skill, training, and psychological resilience." Night. The FA-18E Super Hornet descended through scattered clouds at 17,000 feet, its twin engines humming a familiar song that had become Lieutenant Commander Zara Nightfall Reeves's lullaby over the past 8 years. But today, something was different. The aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan stretched across the Pacific like a steel island, its deck crew moving with the practiced precision of a Swiss timepiece, yet every eye was turned skyward. They weren't watching just any pilot make their approach. They were watching history unfold in real time, though none of them knew it yet. The mystery began 3 hours earlier in the briefing room at Naval Air Station Lemoore. Commander Jake "Viper" Morrison, the most feared Top Gun instructor in the program's 40-year history, had received a classified communication that made his weathered face go pale. The message contained a single line of text and a pilot's service record that seemed impossible. How could someone with Nightfall's credentials be requesting entry into the most elite fighter weapons school on the planet? Her record showed 8 years of flawless service, 3 combat deployments, and a kill ratio that would make seasoned veterans weep with envy. Yet here she was, supposedly a learning pilot making her first carrier landing under evaluation. Something wasn't adding up. Morrison had trained over 2,000 pilots in his career, and he could smell deception from 30,000 feet. His weathered hands gripped the observation tower's railing as he watched the Super Hornet's approach, its nose pitched at exactly the right angle, its speed precisely calculated for a perfect trap. The aircraft's gray silhouette cut through the afternoon haze like a predator stalking its prey, and Morrison found himself holding his breath. "Tower, this is Nightfall requesting permission to land," came the voice over the radio, calm and steady as mountain stone. No nervousness, no hesitation, just the kind of confidence that either came from years of experience or dangerous overconfidence. Morrison leaned forward, his gray eyes narrowing as he studied the approaching aircraft. The Super Hornet's landing gear extended with mechanical precision, the aircraft maintaining perfect alignment with the carrier's centerline. But it was the subtle adjustments, the minute corrections that only a pilot's trained eye could detect, that made Morrison's pulse quicken. This wasn't the flying of a novice. This was the work of someone who had danced with death and lived to tell the tale. The question that burned in his mind like jet fuel was simple. Who was Zara Reeves, and why was she pretending to be something she clearly wasn't? The trap wire caught the Super Hornet's tailhook with a violent precision that would have sent most rookie pilots into their seat harnesses like a crash test dummy. But Lieutenant Commander Zara Reeves absorbed the 4G deceleration with the fluid grace of someone who had performed this maneuver hundreds of times before. Her hands remained steady on the controls, her breathing controlled, and even as 30,000 pounds of fighter jet went from 150 miles per hour to zero in less than 3 seconds. Commander Morrison watched from the tower with growing fascination. The textbook landing had been executed with a precision that bordered on the supernatural, yet according to her file, this was supposed to be Nightfall's first carrier trap. His radio crackled to life as the deck crew began their post-landing procedures, but Morrison barely heard them. His attention was fixed on the cockpit of the Super Hornet, where he could see the pilot running through her shutdown checklist with methodical efficiency. "Viper, you seeing this?" came the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Maria Ghost Santos, Morrison's second-in-command and the only instructor at Top Gun who had never been intimidated by his reputation. She stood beside him in the observation deck, her dark eyes reflecting the same confusion that was eating at Morrison's gut. "I'm seeing it, but I'm not believing it," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent separating truth from fiction in the unforgiving world of naval aviation. "Check her file again. Something's not right." Ghost pulled up Reeves's service record on her tablet, scrolling through 8 years of commendations, deployment records, and training certifications. Says here she graduated from the Naval Academy 7 years ago, completed flight training at Pensacola with top honors, and has been flying Super Hornets out of VFA 31 for the past 3 years. Standard career progression for someone her age. But Morrison wasn't buying it. He had been training naval aviators since before Zara Reeves was born, and he could read pilots like books written in a language only he understood. The woman climbing out of that cockpit moved with the confidence of someone who had stared down enemy fighters and lived to fight another day. Her movements were economical, practiced, and completely at odds with the nervous energy that typically radiated from pilots making their Top Gun debut. As Nightfall removed her helmet, revealing shoulder-length auburn hair that caught the afternoon sunlight like burnished copper, Morrison caught something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. It was the look of someone carrying secrets that could sink aircraft carriers, the weight of untold stories that had been buried so deep they might never surface. This wasn't just another hotshot pilot looking to prove herself at Top Gun. This was someone with a past that the Navy wanted to keep hidden. The deck crew guided Reeves toward the island's superstructure, their movements professional but their eyes curious. Word had already begun to spread through the ship's gossip network that something unusual was happening. Pilots didn't just show up at Top Gun without fanfare, especially not pilots who flew like they had been born in a cockpit. Morrison descended from the observation tower with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes in naval aviation led to funerals. The USS Ronald Reagan's corridors hummed with the constant vibration of machinery and the muffled conversations of 6,000 sailors going about their daily routines, but Morrison barely noticed the familiar sounds. His mind was focused on the woman who had just executed what might have been the most perfect carrier landing he had witnessed in 30 years of naval service. Lieutenant Commander Reeves stood at attention in the debriefing room, her flight suit pristine despite having just completed a cross-country flight from Lemoore. Her posture was textbook military bearing, but Morrison caught the subtle tells that spoke of combat experience. The way her eyes constantly scanned the room for exits, the unconscious positioning of her feet for quick movement, the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested someone always ready for action. "At ease, Lieutenant Commander," Morrison said, settling into the metal chair across from her with the creaking protest of joints that had spent too many years in ejection seats. "Before we begin the official debrief, I have some questions about your background." Nightfall's green eyes met his without flinching, and Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. Those eyes had seen things that most people only experienced in nightmares, and they held secrets that went far deeper than any service record could reveal. I'm ready to answer any questions you have, sir. Your landing today was exceptional, Morrison began, his voice carrying the tone he reserved for interrogations rather than congratulations. In fact, it was so exceptional that it raises some concerns about the accuracy of your file. According to your record, this was your first carrier trap. Care to explain how someone with no carrier experience executes a landing that would make seasoned veterans jealous? For the first time since she had entered the room, Morrison saw something flicker across Reeves's face, a micro-expression that lasted less than a second but spoke volumes. It was the look of someone who had been expecting this question and had spent considerable time preparing an answer that would be both truthful and carefully limited. I've spent considerable time studying carrier landing procedures, sir, Nightfall replied, her voice steady as a laser guidance system. I've also completed extensive simulator training and worked with several experienced carrier pilots who provided mentorship during my preparation for this assignment. Morrison leaned back in his chair, his weathered face betraying nothing of the skepticism that was building in his chest like storm clouds. The answer was perfectly reasonable, technically accurate, and complete bullshit. He had been training pilots long enough to recognize a carefully crafted half-truth when he heard one. The silence stretched between them like a taut cable, and Morrison found himself studying every detail of Nightfall's appearance for clues about her real story. Her flight suit bore the standard patches and insignia of a VFA-31 squadron pilot, but there was something about the way she wore them that suggested they might not tell the whole story. Ghost Santos entered the debriefing room with a tablet clutched in her hands, and an expression that Morrison had learned to associate with discoveries that complicated already complex situations. Her combat boots clicked against the deck plating, with the measured rhythm of someone trying to maintain composure while delivering news that would change everything. "Sir, I think you need to see this," Ghost said, her voice carrying an undertone that made Morrison's instincts sharpen like a blade being honed. She placed the tablet on the metal table between Morrison and Reeves, the screen displaying a classified document that made Morrison's eyebrows climb toward his graying hairline. The document was a mission report dated 18 months earlier, originating from a classified location somewhere in the Middle East. Morrison's eyes scanned the technical language and operational details, but it was the pilot's name in the after-action report that made his breath catch in his throat. Lieutenant Commander Z. Reeves, call sign Nightfall. The mission summary described a deep strike operation against a heavily defended target, executed with surgical precision under impossible conditions. "This is interesting reading, Lieutenant Commander," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew was wrong. "According to this report, you single-handedly destroyed a surface-to-air missile site that had been giving coalition forces trouble for months. The report describes your performance as exceptional and recommends you for the Distinguished Flying Cross." Nightfall's expression remained perfectly neutral, but Morrison caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was calculating how much of the truth she could safely reveal. The game of cat and mouse that had been playing out since her arrival was entering a new phase, and Morrison found himself genuinely curious about what other surprises her classified file might contain. "I was just doing my job, sir," Reeves replied, the kind of answer that veterans gave when they didn't want to discuss missions that haunted their dreams. Morrison recognized the tone because he had used it himself countless times over the years. Ghost cleared her throat and pointed to another section of the report that Morrison had missed in his initial scan. "Sir, there's more. The report mentions that Lieutenant Commander Reeves completed this mission after her wingman was shot down, and she was operating alone behind enemy lines for over 2 hours. Morrison felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with the mechanical precision of an aircraft carrier's catapult system. Zara Reeves wasn't just another pilot looking to enhance her career with a Top Gun certification. She was a combat veteran with a record that would make most fighter pilots weep with envy, and she had been sent to his school for reasons that went far beyond standard professional development. The question that burned in Morrison's mind like jet fuel under compression was simple. What was the Navy really asking him to do with Lieutenant Commander Nightfall Reeves? And more importantly, what wasn't they telling him about why she was here? The classified briefing room aboard the USS Ronald Reagan felt smaller than usual, as Morrison found himself alone with Captain Sarah Hammer Rodriguez, the ship's commanding officer, and one of the few people in the Navy who outranked his legendary status. Rodriguez had requested the private meeting 30 minutes after Ghost had revealed Nightfall's combat record, and Morrison could see in her weathered face the same confusion that had been eating at his gut since Reeves's impossible landing. "Jake, I'm going to be straight with you because we don't have time for the usual diplomatic dancing," Rodriguez said, settling into her chair with the weight of someone carrying burdens that could sink ships. "Lieutenant Commander Reeves isn't here for standard Top Gun training. She's here because someone very high up the chain of command has requested a full evaluation of her capabilities under controlled conditions." Morrison leaned forward, his gray eyes narrowing as he processed this information. In 30 years of naval service, he had learned that when admirals started requesting evaluations of individual pilots, it usually meant something significant was brewing in the geopolitical arena. "What kind of evaluation are we talking about, Captain?" Rodriguez pulled a sealed envelope from her desk drawer, the kind of official correspondence that arrived through channels so classified that most officers would never see one in their entire careers. The kind that comes with orders directly from the Chief of Naval Operations and a classification level that would make your head spin. "All I can tell you is that Nightfall's performance over the next 2 weeks will determine whether she receives an assignment that could change the course of naval aviation history." The weight of Rodriguez's words settled on Morrison's shoulders like a flight suit made of lead. He had trained thousands of pilots over the years, but he had never been asked to evaluate someone whose career might influence the entire trajectory of American naval power. The responsibility was both exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. "What's her real background, Captain?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had earned the right to straight answers through decades of faithful service. "That combat record Ghost showed me is just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it?" Rodriguez nodded, her expression growing more serious than Morrison had ever seen it. Zara Reeves graduated from the Naval Academy at the top of her class, completed flight training with scores that broke records that had stood for 20 years, and has been flying combat missions in classified theaters for the past 5 years. Her official record shows 3 deployments, but the real number is closer to 12. Morrison felt the familiar chill that came with discovering that the world was far more complex than it appeared on the surface. Nightfall wasn't just a combat veteran. She was a ghost pilot whose real service record was so classified that it might as well have been written in invisible ink. The Navy had been using her for missions so sensitive that they couldn't officially exist, and now they were asking Morrison to determine whether she was ready for something even more significant. The implications were staggering and terrifying in equal measure. The ready room buzzed with the low conversations of Top Gun instructors reviewing the day's flight schedules, but Morrison barely heard the familiar sounds of military planning. His mind was still processing Captain Rodriguez's revelations about Nightfall's true background, and he found himself studying every detail of the woman who sat quietly in the corner, reviewing technical manuals with the focused intensity of someone preparing for war. Lieutenant Commander Reeves had changed from her flight suit into the standard-issue khaki uniform that all Top Gun students wore during ground training, but nothing about her appearance suggested she was just another pilot seeking advanced certification. Her movements were too precise, her awareness too sharp, and her presence too commanding for someone who was supposed to be learning the fundamentals of air-to-air combat. "Gentlemen and ladies," Morrison announced, his voice cutting through the room's conversations like a laser-guided missile. Today, we begin a special evaluation program that will test not only tactical skills, but also psychological resilience under extreme pressure. Lieutenant Commander Reeves will be participating in accelerated training scenarios that simulate combat conditions beyond anything we typically use for standard Top Gun curriculum. The room fell silent as Morrison's words sank in. Every instructor present had trained hundreds of pilots, but none of them had ever heard of a student receiving special evaluation treatment on their first day. The implications were obvious. Someone very important was paying attention to whatever happened next. Commander Lisa Banshee Chen, Morrison's most experienced air-to-air combat instructor, raised her hand with the confidence of someone who had never been intimidated by authority. "Sir, what parameters are we using for this evaluation? Standard engagement rules or something more comprehensive?" Morrison felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth as he contemplated the question. Standard Top Gun training involved simulated air-to-air engagements using established rules of engagement that prioritized safety while testing tactical skills. What he was about to propose would push those boundaries far beyond anything the school had attempted before. "We're going to throw everything we have at Lieutenant Commander Reeves," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just declared war on conventional training methods. Multiple adversaries, changing weather conditions, equipment failures, communication blackouts, and time pressure that would make combat veterans sweat bullets. If she's as good as her classified record suggests, she should handle it without breaking stride. Nightfall looked up from her technical manual, and Morrison caught something in her green eyes that made his pulse quicken. It wasn't fear or nervousness. It was the look of a predator who had just spotted prey. For the first time since her arrival, Morrison saw a glimpse of the pilot who had survived 12 classified combat deployments and lived to tell no tales about any of them. The game was about to begin in earnest, and Morrison had the distinct feeling that he was about to discover whether legends were born or simply revealed under pressure. The flight deck of the USS Ronald Reagan at dawn was a cathedral of military precision, with aircraft arranged in perfect formation and deck crews moving through their pre-flight routines with the synchronized efficiency of a ballet company. But this morning felt different to Morrison as he watched Lieutenant Commander Reeves complete her pre-flight inspection of the FA-18E Super Hornet that would serve as her mount for the day's evaluation. Her movements around the aircraft were those of someone who knew every rivet, every system, and every potential failure point that could turn a routine training flight into a life-or-death emergency. She inspected control surfaces with the methodical precision of a surgeon, checked weapons pylons with the attention to detail of a bomb disposal expert, and tested communication systems with the thoroughness of someone who understood that radio silence in combat meant death. "Nightfall, this is Control," Morrison's voice crackled through her helmet's communication system as she settled into the cockpit. "Today's scenario involves multiple unknown contacts approaching from various vectors. Your mission is to identify, engage, and neutralize all threats while maintaining situational awareness of friendly aircraft operating in the same airspace." What Morrison didn't tell her was that he had arranged for 6 instructor pilots to serve as adversaries, each flying different aircraft types and using tactics designed to overwhelm even experienced combat veterans. The scenario had been crafted to test not only her technical skills, but also her ability to process information, make split-second decisions, and execute complex maneuvers under extreme psychological pressure. "Copy, Control," Nightfall replied, her voice carrying the calm confidence that Morrison was beginning to associate with pilots who had looked death in the face and negotiated a temporary truce. "Request permission to launch when ready." As her Super Hornet was positioned on the catapult, Morrison found himself holding his breath despite 30 years of watching aircraft launches. There was something about this particular flight that felt different, as if the universe itself was paying attention to what happened next. The deck crew completed their final checks with practiced efficiency, and the catapult officer gave the signal that would send 30,000 pounds of fighter jets screaming into the Pacific sky. The launch was textbook perfect, with Nightfall's Super Hornet accelerating from 0 to 150 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds. But it was her immediate post-launch maneuvers that made Morrison's eyes widen with professional admiration. Instead of following the standard departure profile, she executed a climbing spiral that maximized her radar coverage while minimizing her own signature, a tactic that belonged in classified combat manuals rather than training exercises. Control, Nightfall is airborne and requesting vectors to engagement area. Her voice came through the radio with the kind of professional calm that Morrison associated with pilots who treated life-or-death situations as routine business meetings. He was beginning to understand that whatever Zara Reeves's real story was, it went far deeper than even her classified file suggested. 25,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, Lieutenant Commander Reeves scanned her radar display with the methodical intensity of someone hunting prey that could kill her if she made a single mistake. The Super Hornet's advanced radar systems painted a complex picture of the airspace around her, showing multiple contacts approaching from different vectors at varying altitudes and speeds. Nightfall, control, Morrison's voice crackled through her headset. Be advised, you have multiple bogies inbound from your 12, 3, and 9 o'clock positions. Rules of engagement are weapons-free after positive identification. What Morrison hadn't told her was that each of those bogies was actually a Top Gun instructor with decades of combat experience, flying different aircraft types, and employing tactics specifically designed to overwhelm a single pilot through coordination and misdirection. The scenario was meant to test her ability to prioritize threats, manage multiple engagements simultaneously, and maintain situational awareness under extreme pressure. Nightfall's response came without hesitation, her voice carrying the kind of confidence that Morrison had only heard from pilots who had survived real combat. Control, Nightfall has multiple contacts on scope, requesting permission to engage as targets are identified. On his radar display in the control room, Morrison watched as Nightfall's Super Hornet began executing a series of maneuvers that defied conventional tactical doctrine. Instead of engaging the closest threat first, she positioned herself to use the terrain masking of a nearby island to break radar lock from 2 of the adversaries, while simultaneously closing on the third from an unexpected angle. Commander Chen, flying as one of the adversary pilots, came on the radio with a tone of professional surprise. Control, this is Banshee. Nightfall just disappeared from my scope using terrain masking that shouldn't be possible at this altitude. How the hell did she know about that radar shadow? Morrison felt his pulse quicken as he realized that Nightfall was employing tactics that went far beyond anything taught in standard flight training. The terrain masking technique she had just used was classified information that belonged in specialized combat manuals, the kind of knowledge that pilots only acquired through missions that officially didn't exist. Nightfall, Banshee, Chen's voice came through the radio as she attempted to reacquire radar contact. You just pulled a move that I've never seen outside of classified briefings. Where did you learn to fly like that? Nightfall's response was professional and revealing in equal measure. Banshee, sometimes the best teacher is necessity, and the best classroom is somewhere you really don't want to be. Morrison leaned forward in his chair, transfixed by the display showing Nightfall's aircraft maneuvering through a complex 3-dimensional chess game with multiple adversaries. She wasn't just flying. She was conducting a symphony of death that turned the sky itself into a weapon. This wasn't the flying of someone learning advanced tactics. This was the work of someone who had already mastered them in environments where mistakes meant coffins draped with American flags. The engagement developed with the lethal precision of a pack hunt, with 6 Top Gun instructors attempting to overwhelm a single pilot through coordinated attacks from multiple vectors. But as Morrison watched his radar display, he began to realize that the hunters were becoming the hunted through tactics that belonged in classified combat manuals rather than training exercises. Nightfall's Super Hornet danced through the sky like a ghost made of titanium and jet fuel, appearing on radar screens for microseconds before vanishing behind terrain features that most pilots didn't even know existed. Her maneuvers defied conventional tactical doctrine, while demonstrating a mastery of advanced combat techniques that took most pilots years of classified missions to develop. "Control, this is Venom," came the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus "Venom" Thompson, Morrison's most experienced adversary pilot, and a man who had never met a tactical challenge he couldn't solve. "Nightfall is using electronic warfare techniques that I've only seen in compartmentalized briefings. She's spoofing our radar signatures and creating false targets that are making coordination between adversaries nearly impossible." Morrison felt a chill run down his spine as he processed Thompson's report. Electronic warfare countermeasures of the type Nightfall was apparently employing were classified technologies that required specialized training and security clearances that went far beyond standard naval aviation requirements. The fact that she was using them with casual precision suggested a background that was even more classified than Captain Rodriguez had implied. "Banshee, Venom, this is Nightfall." Reeves's voice came through the radio with the kind of professional calm that Morrison associated with pilots discussing weather conditions rather than life-or-death tactical situations. "You're both painting me with targeting radar, but I've got a solution on Venom from his 6 o'clock low. Banshee, recommend you break left immediately or you're going to fly into my engagement envelope." The tactical situation displayed on Morrison's screen showed something that should have been impossible. Nightfall had maneuvered into a position where she could engage one adversary while simultaneously forcing a second to break off his attack run to avoid flying into her weapon's range. It was a three-dimensional chess move that required the kind of spatial reasoning and tactical instinct that most pilots never developed. "Jesus Christ," Thompson's voice crackled through the radio as he realized his tactical position had been compromised. "Control, Nightfall just executed a maneuver that forced me into a defensive position while she maintained offensive capability against multiple targets. I've never seen anything like it outside of classified after-action reports." Morrison leaned back in his chair, his mind racing as he tried to process what he was witnessing. Lieutenant Commander Zara Reeves wasn't just demonstrating advanced piloting skills. She was employing tactics that suggested combat experience in theaters so classified that they might not officially exist. The Navy hadn't sent her to Top Gun for training. They had sent her for evaluation by the only instructors qualified to assess whether she was ready for whatever came next. The radio crackled with the controlled chaos of multiple aircraft maneuvering through a complex tactical scenario, but Morrison's attention was focused on a single voice that cut through the confusion with the precision of a surgical instrument. Nightfall's communications were a masterclass in tactical brevity, each transmission containing exactly the information necessary to maintain situational awareness without revealing her intentions to adversaries listening on the same frequency. "Control, Nightfall has lock-on confirmation for adversary-designated Alpha." Her voice carried the kind of professional detachment that Morrison associated with pilots who had delivered real ordnance against real targets in places where mistakes had permanent consequences. "Engaging with simulated AIM 120 at maximum effective range." On his tactical display, Morrison watched as Nightfall's Super Hornet launched a simulated missile engagement that demonstrated mastery of beyond visual range combat tactics. But what made his pulse quicken was the sophistication of her approach. She had maneuvered into a position where her simulated missile would force two adversary aircraft to break their coordinated attack, while simultaneously positioning herself for a secondary engagement opportunity. "Kill confirmed on Alpha," came the voice of the exercise controller, a Navy lieutenant whose job was to adjudicate simulated combat engagements with the impartiality of a referee and the technical expertise of someone who understood every nuance of air-to-air combat. Venom is out of the exercise. Nightfall, you have 4 remaining adversaries and permission to continue engagement. What followed was a display of aerial combat artistry that Morrison would remember for the rest of his career. Nightfall's Super Hornet moved through the sky like a predator that had evolved specifically for three-dimensional hunting, using altitude, speed, and positioning to turn tactical disadvantages into overwhelming advantages. Her aircraft appeared and disappeared from radar screens with the unpredictability of quantum physics, striking from unexpected angles with weapons solutions that seemed to materialize from thin air. "Control, this is Razor," came the voice of Commander Patricia "Razor" Williams, a pilot whose own combat record included multiple confirmed kills and a distinguished flying cross earned in classified operations. "Nightfall just engaged me from a vector that shouldn't have been possible given her last known position. I'm beginning to think we're not dealing with a standard evaluation scenario here." Morrison found himself nodding in agreement as he watched the tactical display. What he was witnessing went far beyond the capabilities of any pilot who had received standard naval aviation training. Nightfall was demonstrating combat instincts that could only be developed through exposure to real threats in real combat situations, the kind of experience that left pilots either dead or transformed into something approaching human weapon systems. The exercise was revealing not just Nightfall's capabilities, but also the true purpose of her presence at Top Gun. This wasn't training. This was a demonstration designed to answer a question that someone very high up the chain of command needed answered with absolute certainty. Commander Williams found herself in a tactical position that violated every principle of air-to-air combat she had learned in 20 years of naval aviation. Nightfall had somehow maneuvered into her blind spot, while simultaneously maintaining offensive capability against 3 other adversaries, a feat that should have been mathematically impossible given the limitations of physics and human reaction time. "Control, Razor is defensive," Williams transmitted, her voice carrying the kind of professional frustration that came from being outmaneuvered by someone who appeared to be rewriting the rules of aerial combat in real time. "Nightfall has achieved a position that gives her simultaneous solutions on multiple targets while denying us coordinated attack opportunities." Morrison watched his tactical display with growing fascination as the exercise developed into something that resembled a masterclass in applied tactical theory rather than a standard training scenario. Nightfall's Super Hornet had become the center of a three-dimensional chess game where every move created multiple future possibilities, and she appeared to be calculating several moves ahead of her adversaries. "Nightfall, this is Control," Morrison transmitted, his voice carrying a tone that suggested the exercise was entering uncharted territory. "You've eliminated 2 adversaries and maneuvered 3 others into defensive positions. Explain your tactical approach for the benefit of our evaluation." Her response came without hesitation, delivered with the kind of professional precision that Morrison associated with classified mission briefings. "Control, I'm using vertical separation and terrain masking to create multiple engagement opportunities while denying adversaries the ability to coordinate their attacks. Each adversary is being forced to react to threats from unexpected vectors, which prevents them from executing coordinated defensive maneuvers." What Morrison didn't hear in her transmission was any indication of stress, uncertainty, or the kind of cognitive overload that typically affected pilots attempting to manage multiple simultaneous engagements. Nightfall was discussing complex tactical maneuvers with the same calm detachment that most people used to order coffee, suggesting a level of combat experience that went far beyond her official service record. "Control, this is Ghost," came the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Santos from her position as exercise safety observer. Nightfall's tactics are consistent with classified air-to-air engagement protocols that I've only seen in compartmentalized briefings. Someone needs to explain how a pilot supposedly receiving basic Top Gun training is employing techniques that most instructors have never seen outside of theoretical discussions. Morrison felt the pieces of a very complex puzzle clicking into place with mechanical precision. The Navy hadn't sent Zara Reeves to Top Gun for training or evaluation. They had sent her to demonstrate capabilities that went far beyond anything in the standard naval aviation toolkit, and they were using Morrison's instructors as unknowing participants in a test whose true purpose remained classified at levels that made his security clearance seem like a library card. The tactical exercise reached its climax as Nightfall's Super Hornet climbed toward 40,000 feet, using the thin air and reduced radar effectiveness at extreme altitude to create what Morrison recognized as a classical high-altitude ambush position. Her remaining 3 adversaries were spread across lower altitudes, each attempting to regain tactical initiative against a pilot who seemed to anticipate their moves before they made them. "Control, this is Nightfall." Her voice crackled through the radio, with the kind of professional calm that Morrison had learned to associate with pilots who treated impossible situations as routine challenges. "I have solutions on all remaining adversaries, and am prepared to demonstrate simultaneous multi-target engagement protocols upon your authorization." Morrison felt his eyebrows climb toward his graying hairline as he processed her transmission. Multi-target engagement protocols were classified tactics that allowed a single pilot to engage multiple adversaries simultaneously using advanced radar management and weapons coordination techniques. The fact that Nightfall was volunteering to demonstrate these capabilities suggested that someone had specifically requested a full display of her tactical arsenal. "Nightfall, Control authorizes demonstration of advanced engagement protocols," Morrison transmitted, his voice carrying the weight of someone who realized he was about to witness something that would redefine his understanding of what individual pilots could accomplish under ideal conditions. What followed was a 3-minute masterclass in applied tactical theory that Morrison would later describe as the most sophisticated display of airmanship he had witnessed in 30 years of naval aviation. Nightfall's Super Hornet descended from altitude like a hawk striking multiple prey simultaneously, her aircraft's radar painting targeting solutions on 3 adversaries, while her electronic warfare systems denied them the ability to coordinate defensive responses. "Multiple kills confirmed," announced the exercise controller, his voice carrying a tone of professional amazement. "Nightfall has successfully engaged and eliminated all adversary aircraft using tactics that I've never seen outside of classified theoretical papers. Exercise complete." The radio fell silent for several seconds as the implications of what had just occurred sank in among the participating pilots and controllers. Morrison found himself staring at his tactical display, which showed Nightfall's Super Hornet alone in the exercise airspace, having eliminated 6 of the most experienced instructor pilots at Top Gun using tactics that belonged in classified weapons school curricula. "Control, this is Nightfall requesting vectors for recovery." Her voice came through the radio with the same professional calm she had maintained throughout the entire exercise, as if single-handedly defeating 6 adversaries in simulated combat was just another day at the office. Morrison realized that he had just witnessed a demonstration designed to answer questions that went far beyond standard pilot evaluation. Someone very high up the chain of command wanted to know exactly what Lieutenant Commander Zara Reeves was capable of accomplishing under controlled conditions, and now they had their answer. The question that remained was what they planned to do with that information. The debriefing room felt charged with an energy that Morrison had only experienced after real combat missions, when pilots gathered to dissect life-and-death decisions with the clinical precision of surgeons examining their own work. But today's atmosphere carried an additional element that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The presence of officers whose rank insignia and security badges suggested they had traveled from Washington specifically to witness Nightfall's performance. Captain Rodriguez entered the room followed by two individuals whom Morrison didn't recognize, but whose bearing screamed intelligence community from 50 yards. They wore unremarkable civilian clothes, carried themselves with the confident posture of people accustomed to wielding authority, and possessed the kind of eyes that missed nothing while revealing even less. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez began, her voice carrying the formal tone that Morrison associated with briefings that would later be classified at levels requiring special storage facilities. Today's exercise was conducted under the observation of representatives from organizations whose interest in Lieutenant Commander Reeves extends beyond standard naval aviation career development. Morrison felt his pulse quicken as he realized that Nightfall's performance had been evaluated not just by Top Gun instructors, but by individuals whose job descriptions probably didn't officially exist. The elaborate exercise hadn't been designed to test her readiness for standard naval aviation assignments. It had been a demonstration for people who made decisions about operations that never appeared in congressional briefings. One of the civilian observers stepped forward, a woman whose silver hair and weathered features suggested decades of experience in making decisions that affected national security. "Commander Morrison, your instructors have just witnessed tactics and capabilities that represent the cutting edge of air-to-air combat doctrine. Lieutenant Commander Reeves has demonstrated proficiency in techniques that most pilots never encounter outside of highly classified training programs." Nightfall sat quietly in the corner of the room, her expression revealing nothing about her thoughts regarding this unexpected revelation about the true nature of her evaluation. Morrison caught something in her green eyes that suggested she had been expecting this moment, as if the elaborate charade of being a learning pilot had been part of a larger script that only she and her handlers had been allowed to read. "The question before us now," the civilian observer continued, her voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to briefing presidents and cabinet members, "is whether Lieutenant Commander Reeves is ready for an assignment that will require her to operate independently in environments where traditional support structures don't exist, and failure could have consequences that extend far beyond individual casualties." Morrison felt the room's temperature seem to drop several degrees as the implications of those words sank in. He had spent 30 years training naval aviators for conventional warfare scenarios, but what was being described sounded like something that belonged in the realm of special operations rather than standard naval aviation. The realization that Nightfall might be destined for missions that existed in the shadows between official military operations and deniable activities made his blood run cold. Commander Chen leaned forward in her chair, her expression reflecting the same confusion that Morrison felt building in his chest. "Ma'am, are we talking about conventional naval aviation assignments or something that falls outside standard operational parameters?" The civilian observer's smile carried no warmth as she responded with the kind of diplomatic non-answer that revealed everything while confirming nothing. "Commander, let's just say that Lieutenant Commander Reeves's next assignment will require her to demonstrate the same level of tactical excellence she displayed today, but in environments where the margin for error approaches absolute zero, and the consequences of discovery could affect national security at the highest levels." The tension in the debriefing room was thick enough to cut with a survival knife, as Morrison processed the implications of what he was hearing. 30 years of naval service had taught him to read between the lines of official communications, and what was being described sounded suspiciously like preparation for missions that would never appear in congressional oversight hearings or historical records. "With respect, ma'am," Morrison said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had earned the right to ask difficult questions through decades of faithful service, "what exactly are we preparing Lieutenant Commander Reeves for? Because What I witnessed today went far beyond standard naval aviation capabilities, and your presence here suggests that her next assignment isn't going to involve routine carrier operations. The second civilian observer, a man whose premature gray hair and intense brown eyes suggested a career spent in briefing rooms where maps had more red pins than blue ones, stepped forward with the measured pace of someone choosing his words very carefully. Commander Morrison, there are threats to American national security that exist in spaces between conventional military responses and diplomatic solutions, he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who dealt with problems that kept presidents awake at night. These threats require assets who can operate independently, think creatively under extreme pressure, and accomplish objectives that officially never happened using methods that leave no fingerprints. Morrison felt his stomach clench as he realized what was being described. The elaborate evaluation process, Nightfall's impossible tactical skills, and the presence of intelligence community observers all pointed toward a single, terrifying conclusion. Zara Reeves was being prepared for missions that existed in the classified space, where military operations met espionage activities. Nightfall finally spoke, her voice cutting through the room's tension like a laser-guided munition. "Gentlemen, I appreciate the dramatic presentation, but everyone in this room knows why I'm here. The question isn't whether I'm qualified for unconventional assignments. The question is whether the people making these decisions understand the personal cost of asking someone to operate in spaces where success is measured by the absence of evidence and failure means disappearing from official records." Her words hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft, carrying implications that made Morrison realize he was witnessing the intersection of individual capability and national necessity. The Navy hadn't just discovered an exceptionally talented pilot. They had found someone whose unique combination of skills and psychological resilience made her suitable for missions that required both tactical excellence and the ability to operate completely outside official support structures. The civilian observers exchanged glances that suggested they had found exactly what they were looking for, and Morrison felt a chill run down his spine as he contemplated what that might mean for Nightfall's future. Captain Rodriguez cleared her throat with the authority of someone who had commanded aircraft carriers in hostile waters and lived to brief admirals about the experience. The sound cut through the room's tension like a steam catapult launching aircraft into combat, demanding attention from everyone present regardless of their security clearance or institutional authority. "Before this conversation goes any further into areas that might require special storage facilities," Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the diplomatic precision of someone who had spent years navigating the treacherous waters between military necessity and political reality. "I think Lieutenant Commander Reeves deserves to understand exactly what kind of assignments are being considered for someone with her unique qualifications." Morrison watched as Nightfall's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, revealing for the first time since her arrival a glimpse of genuine curiosity mixed with the kind of wariness that came from years of experience with military organization that specialized in understated descriptions of dangerous assignments. Her green eyes moved between the civilian observers with the calculated attention of someone evaluating potential threats. The female civilian observer consulted a tablet that Morrison suspected contained more classified information than most people encountered in their entire careers. "Lieutenant Commander, your performance today confirmed capabilities that make you suitable for assignments involving deep penetration reconnaissance, surgical strike operations, and intelligence gathering in environments where traditional military assets cannot operate without creating diplomatic incidents." Morrison felt his eyebrows climb toward his receding hairline as he processed the euphemistic language being used to describe what sounded suspiciously like missions that existed somewhere between legitimate military operations and activities that required plausible deniability at the highest levels of government. "In plain English," Nightfall replied, her voice carrying the kind of directness that Morrison associated with combat veterans who had developed allergic reactions to bureaucratic doublespeak. "You're talking about missions where I would operate alone, without official support, in places where getting caught would result in the United States government disavowing any knowledge of my existence." The male civilian observer nodded with the kind of professional respect that Morrison recognized as acknowledgement between practitioners of dangerous trades. "That's a remarkably accurate assessment, Lieutenant Commander. These assignments would require someone who can maintain operational effectiveness while psychologically isolated from traditional support structures, make strategic decisions without consultation, and accomplish objectives that serve national interests while maintaining complete operational security." Morrison realized he was witnessing a recruitment conversation for missions that officially didn't exist, conducted by people whose job titles probably weren't accurate, involving assignments that would never appear in personnel files or promotion boards. The elaborately staged evaluation at Top Gun hadn't been designed to test Nightfall's readiness for advanced naval aviation assignments. It had been a final examination for entry into a world where success was measured by the absence of evidence and failure meant becoming a footnote in classified files that nobody would ever read. The silence that followed the civilian observer's frank assessment stretched like a taut cable under maximum tension, with everyone in the room understanding that they were witnessing a conversation that would determine the trajectory of Lieutenant Commander Reeves's career and possibly her life. Morrison found himself studying Nightfall's face for any indication of how she was processing this information, but her expression remained as unreadable as a classified document. "I have one question before I provide any response to this proposal," Nightfall said finally, her voice carrying the kind of steady calm that Morrison associated with pilots making life-or-death decisions in the cockpit. "What happens to the people I care about if something goes wrong during one of these assignments? Because operating without official support means that if I disappear, there's no one to provide assistance to family members who might ask inconvenient questions." The female civilian observer's expression softened almost imperceptibly, revealing for the first time a glimpse of humanity beneath the professional detachment. "Lieutenant Commander, anyone selected for this type of assignment receives comprehensive support for family members, including financial security, career assistance, and protection services if circumstances require them. We understand that asking someone to operate in the shadows requires us to ensure that the people they care about are protected from the consequences of that choice." Morrison felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the conversation was moving from theoretical discussion to practical planning, with the inexorable momentum of an aircraft carrier changing course. The civilian observers weren't just evaluating Nightfall's suitability for classified assignments. They were actively recruiting her for missions that would remove her from conventional military service and place her in a world where success and failure were measured by standards that most people never contemplated. "There's something else you should understand," the male observer added, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had delivered similar briefings to other exceptional individuals who had faced the same choice. "Once you accept this type of assignment, your official military record becomes a carefully constructed fiction designed to provide cover for activities that serve national interests but can never be acknowledged. You would essentially become a ghost who operates in spaces between official military doctrine and diplomatic impossibility." Nightfall leaned back in her chair, her green eyes reflecting the kind of calculation that Morrison had observed in pilots weighing tactical options under extreme time pressure. He realized he was watching someone contemplate a decision that would fundamentally alter not just her career trajectory, but her entire relationship with the world she had known as a naval officer. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked, her voice betraying none of the emotional weight that such a decision must carry. 72 hours, came the reply, delivered with the kind of bureaucratic precision that suggested the timeline had been determined by people who understood that some decisions required time for proper consideration, while others were constrained by operational necessities that didn't accommodate extended deliberation. The debriefing room emptied with the efficient precision of a military formation dissolving after dismissal, leaving Morrison alone with Lieutenant Commander Reeves and the weight of secrets that felt heavier than an aircraft carrier's anchor chain. The civilian observers had departed with their tablets full of classified assessments, and their minds made up about Nightfall's suitability for assignments that existed in the shadows between official military operations and deniable activities. Morrison found himself studying the woman who sat quietly across from him, her flight suit bearing the standard patches and insignia of a naval aviator, but her presence carrying the unmistakable aura of someone who had operated far beyond the boundaries of conventional military service. The elaborate charade of being a learning pilot seeking Top Gun certification had been stripped away, revealing someone whose true capabilities posed questions that made his head spin. "Off the record, Lieutenant Commander," Morrison said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had earned the right to straight answers through 30 years of faithful service. "How long have you been doing missions that don't officially exist?" Nightfall's smile carried no humor as she contemplated her response with the careful precision of someone who had learned that careless words could have consequences extending far beyond hurt feelings. "Commander, let's just say that my official service record represents about 40% of my actual flight hours, and the missions that made it into my file were the ones where diplomatic considerations allowed them to be acknowledged." Morrison felt his stomach clench as he processed the implications of her answer. If Nightfall's official record showed 8 years of distinguished service, including multiple combat deployments, and that represented less than half of her actual operational experience, then she had been conducting classified missions almost from the moment she completed flight training. The Navy had been using her as a deniable asset for years, and now they were offering her the opportunity to make that arrangement official and permanent. "What made you volunteer for that kind of work?" Morrison asked, his curiosity overcoming his professional discretion. Because most pilots who get offered classified assignments find ways to politely decline without damaging their careers. Nightfall's expression grew distant as she contemplated memories that Morrison suspected were filed in mental compartments that rarely opened. "Commander, some people join the military to serve their country. Others do it to prove something to themselves or their families. I joined because I discovered that I'm very good at solving problems that can't be solved through conventional means, and there are threats to American interests that require unconventional solutions." Morrison realized he was listening to someone who had found her calling in the spaces between official military doctrine and the messy realities of protecting national security in a world where enemies didn't always wear uniforms or operate from identifiable bases. Nightfall wasn't just a pilot. She was a weapons system that had been refined through years of classified operations into something approaching human perfection for specific types of missions. The weight of unspoken truths hung between Morrison and Nightfall like the tension in a carrier's arresting cable, loaded with potential energy that could either bring aircraft safely to rest or snap with catastrophic consequences. Morrison found himself contemplating the ethical implications of training someone for missions that officially didn't exist, conducted by people whose names didn't appear on organizational charts, serving objectives that would never be acknowledged in congressional hearings. "Lieutenant Commander," Morrison said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent 3 decades balancing military necessity against personal conscience, "I need to ask you something that goes beyond professional curiosity. Are you planning to accept their offer?" Nightfall's green eyes met his with the kind of directness that Morrison associated with pilots who had learned to compartmentalize emotional considerations when tactical situations required clear thinking. "Commander, I've been operating in that world for years already. The only difference is that Now they're offering to make it official and provide the support structure that I've been operating without. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine as he contemplated what she was describing. The elaborate evaluation at Top Gun hadn't been designed to determine whether she was qualified for classified assignments. It had been a demonstration for intelligence community observers who needed to confirm that their unofficial asset was ready for official recruitment into programs that existed beyond the reach of traditional military oversight. "What about the personal cost?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying the concern of someone who had seen too many exceptional officers disappear into classified assignments and emerge as different people, if they emerged at all. Operating without official support structures changes people in ways that aren't always reversible. Nightfall's smile carried a sadness that Morrison found deeply unsettling, as if she was contemplating losses that went far beyond the normal sacrifices expected of military service. "Commander, I stopped being a normal person about 5 years ago, when I accepted my first mission that required me to operate completely alone in a place where capture meant torture and death, and success meant preventing something that would have killed thousands of innocent people. The personal cost has already been paid." Morrison realized he was listening to someone who had already made the psychological transition from conventional military officer to something that existed in the classified spaces between official doctrine and operational necessity. The decision she faced wasn't whether to accept a new type of assignment. It was whether to formalize an arrangement that had already fundamentally altered her relationship with the world. The conversation was interrupted by Morrison's radio, crackling to life with a message that would change everything they thought they understood about Nightfall's situation. "Commander Morrison, please report to Captain Rodriguez immediately. We have a developing situation that requires Lieutenant Commander Reeves's immediate attention." Captain Rodriguez's office felt smaller than usual as Morrison and Nightfall entered to find the ship's commanding officer studying a classified message that had apparently arrived through channels so secure that the communication equipment required special installation and maintenance by personnel with clearances that exceeded most admirals. The tension in Rodriguez's weathered features suggested that whatever information the message contained, it carried implications that extended far beyond routine military operations. "Lieutenant Commander Reeves," Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled urgency that Morrison associated with situations where minutes could determine the difference between successful operations and international incidents. "I've just received a priority communication that changes the timeline for your decision about future assignments. We have a developing situation that requires immediate response from someone with your specific qualifications." Morrison felt his pulse quicken as he realized that the theoretical discussion about classified missions was about to become very practical very quickly. The civilian observers hadn't departed the ship after Nightfall's evaluation. They had been waiting for precisely this type of urgent communication that would test her readiness for the kind of assignments they had been describing in euphemistic terms. Nightfall's expression remained perfectly controlled as she processed this information, but Morrison caught the subtle shift in her posture that suggested someone transitioning from administrative discussions to operational planning. "Captain, what's the nature of the situation?" Rodriguez consulted the classified message with the careful precision of someone reading information that could start wars if mishandled. 12 hours ago, a commercial airliner disappeared from radar while flying over international waters approximately 400 miles southwest of our current position. Initial search and rescue efforts have been unsuccessful, but intelligence intercepts suggest that the disappearance may not have been accidental. Morrison felt his stomach clench as he processed the implications of Rodriguez's carefully chosen words. Commercial aircraft didn't simply vanish from radar without leaving some trace of their final moments, and the mention of intelligence intercepts suggested that hostile actors might have been involved in whatever had happened to the missing plane. "What kind of intelligence intercepts?" Nightfall asked, her voice carrying the kind of professional detachment that Morrison associated with pilots who had learned to process disturbing information without allowing emotional reactions to interfere with tactical analysis. Rodriguez's expression grew more grim as she continued reading from the classified message. Signal intelligence assets detected encrypted communications consistent with state-sponsored terrorist organizations, discussing a successful acquisition of high-value assets approximately 30 minutes before the airliner's disappearance. The passenger manifest included individuals whose capture would provide hostile actors with intelligence capabilities that could compromise ongoing operations in multiple theaters. Morrison realized they were discussing not just a missing airliner, but a potential hostage situation involving individuals whose knowledge or expertise made them strategically valuable to America's enemies. The situation required immediate response by someone who could operate independently in hostile territory while accomplishing objectives that served national security interests without creating diplomatic complications. The classified briefing room that Rodriguez led them to was secured behind multiple layers of physical and electronic protection that Morrison recognized as the kind of facilities used for discussing operations that could affect the balance of power between nations. The walls were lined with soundproofing materials and electronic countermeasures that created a bubble of security within which conversations could occur without fear of surveillance by hostile intelligence services. Waiting for them were the two civilian observers who had evaluated Nightfall's performance, along with a third individual whose presence made Morrison's blood run cold. Admiral Rebecca "Iceberg" Harrison was a legendary figure in naval aviation whose official career had been distinguished enough to earn her 4 stars, but whose unofficial activities were rumored to involve oversight of programs that existed so far beyond traditional military operations that they might as well have been science fiction. "Lieutenant Commander Reeves," Admiral Harrison said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that Morrison associated with people who made decisions that affected the fate of nations. "The situation we're about to describe requires immediate action by someone who can operate independently in hostile territory while accomplishing objectives that serve critical national security interests. Based on your performance evaluation and your classified operational history, you are the only asset currently available who possesses the necessary qualifications." Morrison watched as Nightfall's expression shifted into what he recognized as operational planning mode, her mind already beginning to process tactical requirements and potential complications before she had even heard the full briefing. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, like watching a weapon system transitioning from standby to active targeting status. "Admiral, what are the operational parameters?" Nightfall asked, her voice carrying the kind of professional precision that Morrison associated with pilots who had learned to ask exactly the right questions to understand complex situations quickly and completely. Admiral Harrison activated a large display screen that showed satellite imagery of a remote island chain in the South Pacific, the kind of location that appeared on very few maps and attracted attention from even fewer legitimate commercial or military activities. "Signals Intelligence has traced the missing airliner to this location, which our analysts believe is being used as a staging area for operations by a state-sponsored organization that specializes in acquiring high-value human assets for intelligence exploitation." Morrison felt his understanding of the situation crystallizing with the mechanical precision of a targeting computer achieving lock-on. The missing airliner hadn't crashed. It had been hijacked and flown to a location where its passengers could be subjected to interrogation techniques that would extract whatever information made them valuable to hostile intelligence services. The situation required immediate rescue operations conducted by someone who could penetrate hostile territory, locate and extract civilians, and accomplish the mission without leaving evidence that could be traced back to American involvement. "What's the extraction timeline?" Nightfall asked, demonstrating the kind of tactical thinking that confirmed Morrison's growing suspicion that she had conducted similar missions before. 72 hours maximum," Admiral Harrison replied, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that some deadlines were determined by operational necessities rather than administrative convenience. The tactical planning session that followed Admiral Harrison's briefing resembled something between a graduate-level seminar in applied military theory and a war council planning an invasion of a sovereign nation. The classified briefing room filled with maps, satellite imagery, intelligence reports, and technical specifications for equipment that Morrison suspected existed in inventory systems that required security clearances he didn't possess. Nightfall studied the satellite imagery with the focused intensity of someone who had learned to extract tactical intelligence from reconnaissance data under time pressure that measured lives in minutes rather than hours. Her questions demonstrated knowledge of infiltration techniques, signal intelligence protocols, and extraction procedures that belonged in specialized training programs rather than standard naval aviation curricula. "The target island has sophisticated radar coverage and surface-to-air missile systems consistent with state-sponsored defensive installations," Admiral Harrison explained, pointing to features on the satellite imagery that Morrison's trained eye could barely distinguish from natural terrain. Conventional military approach would require significant naval and air assets, which would create diplomatic complications that current political considerations cannot accommodate. Morrison realized they were discussing a mission that required someone to penetrate hostile territory using methods that would leave no evidence of American involvement, while accomplishing objectives that served critical national security interests. The operational requirements went far beyond anything he had encountered in 30 years of conventional naval service. "What kind of aircraft are we discussing for infiltration?" Nightfall asked, her question revealing familiarity with unconventional aviation assets that Morrison suspected were not listed in standard Navy inventory systems. One of the civilian observers consulted a tablet containing information that Morrison suspected was classified at levels that made his security clearance seem like a library card. "We have access to experimental stealth aircraft that can deliver a single operator to the target area while remaining undetectable to conventional radar systems. The aircraft is designed for missions exactly like this one." Morrison felt his eyebrows climb toward his receding hairline as he processed what was being described. The mission would involve flying an experimental aircraft into hostile territory, conducting reconnaissance to locate kidnapped civilians, planning and executing a rescue operation, and extracting everyone involved without leaving evidence that could be traced back to American involvement. The operational complexity was staggering, and the personal risk to whoever accepted the assignment approached the level of a suicide mission disguised as a routine deployment. "What kind of support assets would be available during the operation?" Nightfall asked, demonstrating the kind of tactical thinking that confirmed Morrison's suspicion that she was evaluating mission requirements rather than deciding whether to accept the assignment. Admiral Harrison's expression grew more serious as she contemplated her response. "None. This operation requires complete operational independence to maintain plausible deniability. Success depends entirely on individual capability and resourcefulness." The weight of Admiral Harrison's words settled over the briefing room like smoke from a crashed aircraft, carrying implications that made Morrison realize he was witnessing the intersection of individual capability and national necessity in its most extreme form. Nightfall would be operating completely alone, in hostile territory, against well-armed opponents, with no possibility of assistance if things went wrong. "Admiral," Morrison said, his voice carrying the concern of someone who had spent 30 years balancing military objectives against human costs. What you're describing sounds like a mission that belongs in the realm of special operations rather than naval aviation. Are we certain that Lieutenant Commander Reeves possesses the necessary skills for this type of assignment? Admiral Harrison's smile carried no warmth as she responded with the kind of confidence that came from access to information that Morrison's security clearance didn't encompass. Commander, Lieutenant Commander Reeves has successfully completed 7 similar missions over the past 4 years, including operations in environments where discovery would have created international incidents and failure would have resulted in the deaths of American intelligence assets operating in deep cover. Morrison felt his understanding of Nightfall's true background shift like tectonic plates rearranging themselves beneath the surface of his consciousness. She wasn't just a naval aviator with classified experience. She was a specialist in exactly the type of impossible mission that Admiral Harrison was describing. Her presence at Top Gun hadn't been about evaluation or training. It had been about positioning her for rapid deployment when situations like this one developed. "What's the civilian casualty count on the aircraft?" Nightfall asked, her question demonstrating the kind of tactical priorities that Morrison associated with operators who had learned to think about human costs in strategic terms rather than emotional ones. The female civilian observer consulted her tablet with the careful precision of someone handling information that could affect the fate of innocent people. 237 passengers and crew, including 12 individuals whose knowledge of classified American operations makes their interrogation by hostile intelligence services a critical national security threat. Morrison realized the mission involved not just rescuing kidnapped civilians, but preventing a potential intelligence catastrophe that could compromise American operations around the world. The operational stakes extended far beyond the lives of individual hostages to include the security of ongoing classified programs and the safety of intelligence assets operating in hostile territories. "Timeline for mission launch?" Nightfall asked, her voice carrying the kind of professional detachment that Morrison associated with pilots who had learned to compartmentalize emotional considerations when operational requirements demanded immediate action. Admiral Harrison checked her watch with the mechanical precision of someone whose life had been measured in mission deadlines for more years than Morrison cared to calculate. 18 hours. The experimental aircraft is already being prepared for deployment, and intelligence assets are providing real-time surveillance of the target area to support mission planning. Morrison found himself contemplating the ethical implications of asking someone to undertake a mission that combined the tactical complexity of a military operation with the diplomatic sensitivity of a covert intelligence activity, all while operating under conditions that eliminated any possibility of outside assistance. Lieutenant Commander Reeves stood and walked to the large display screen showing satellite imagery of the target island, her movement carrying the purposeful precision of someone transitioning from passive observer to active participant in operational planning. Morrison watched as she studied the reconnaissance data with the focused intensity of someone who had learned to extract tactical intelligence from limited information under extreme time pressure. "The surface-to-air missile installations are positioned to provide overlapping coverage of conventional approach routes," she observed, her voice carrying the kind of analytical detachment that Morrison associated with pilots who could process complex tactical situations while under fire. "But there's a gap in radar coverage on the northern approach that could be exploited using terrain masking and electronic countermeasures." Admiral Harrison nodded with the kind of professional respect that Morrison recognized as acknowledgement between practitioners of dangerous trades. "Our intelligence analysts reached the same conclusion, Lieutenant Commander. The northern approach offers the best opportunity for undetected infiltration, but it also requires flying at extremely low altitude through terrain that provides minimal margin for error." Morrison felt his pulse quicken as he contemplated what was being described. Low-altitude penetration of hostile territory in an experimental aircraft required the kind of piloting skills that pushed human capabilities to their absolute limits while leaving no room for mechanical failure or navigation errors. The slightest mistake would result not just in mission failure, but in the kind of international incident that could escalate into broader military conflict. "What kind of ground assets am I expected to encounter?" Nightfall asked, demonstrating familiarity with tactical planning procedures that confirmed Morrison's growing understanding of her true background and capabilities. One of the civilian observers activated a secondary display showing intelligence assessments of hostile forces on the target island. Approximately 200 personnel with military training and equipment consistent with special operations capabilities. They're organized into defensive positions designed to prevent exactly the type of rescue operation you would be conducting. Morrison realized the mission involved not just penetrating hostile airspace and locating kidnapped civilians, but engaging well-trained opponents who would be expecting rescue attempts and prepared to respond with lethal force. The tactical odds were overwhelming, and success would depend entirely on Nightfall's ability to outthink and outfight enemies who possessed every advantage except individual skill and operational flexibility. "Extraction procedures?" Nightfall asked, her questions revealing the kind of systematic thinking that Morrison associated with operators who had survived similar missions through careful planning and flawless execution. Admiral Harrison's expression grew more serious as she contemplated the most dangerous aspect of the proposed operation. "The same experimental aircraft that delivers you to the target area. You would need to establish a secure landing zone, extract all hostages, and depart the area before hostile forces could organize an effective response." Morrison found himself contemplating the complexity of an operation that required one person to accomplish objectives that would normally require coordinated efforts by multiple specialized military units operating with extensive support assets. The silence that followed Admiral Harrison's description of the extraction procedures stretched like a taut cable under maximum tension, with everyone present understanding that they were discussing an operation that pushed the boundaries of what individual human capability could accomplish under ideal conditions. Morrison found himself studying Nightfall's expression for any indication of how she was processing the tactical requirements and personal risks involved. "Admiral," Nightfall said finally, her voice carrying the kind of steady calm that Morrison associated with pilots who had learned to make life-or-death decisions under extreme time pressure. "I need to understand something about the political parameters of this mission. What happens if I'm captured or killed during the operation?" Admiral Harrison's response came without hesitation, delivered with the kind of bureaucratic precision that revealed years of experience in managing operations that existed beyond the reach of traditional military accountability. "Official records would show that you died in a training accident during routine flight operations. Your family would receive full military honors and benefits consistent with line-of-duty death, but there would be no acknowledgement of your actual activities or the circumstances of your loss." Morrison felt a chill run down his spine as he contemplated the implications of what he was hearing. The mission existed so far outside official military operations that failure would be covered up through carefully constructed lies designed to protect government deniability, while providing minimal comfort to grieving family members who would never know the truth about their loved one's sacrifice. "And if the mission succeeds but creates diplomatic complications?" Nightfall continued, demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking that confirmed her extensive experience with classified operations that existed in the spaces between official military doctrine and international law. The male civilian observer leaned forward with the careful precision of someone choosing words that would be technically accurate while revealing as little as possible. Success would be measured by the safe return of American civilians and the absence of evidence linking their rescue to United States government involvement. Diplomatic considerations would be managed through channels that specialize in maintaining plausible deniability regarding activities that serve national interests. Morrison realized he was witnessing a recruitment conversation for a mission that officially would never happen, conducted by people whose job titles probably weren't accurate, involving objectives that would never appear in congressional briefings or historical records. The operation existed in the classified space where military necessity met political impossibility, requiring someone who could accomplish strategic objectives while accepting personal risks that approached the level of certain death. "I have one final question," Nightfall said, her voice carrying a tone that suggested she was approaching the moment of decision. "If I accept this mission and survive, what happens next? Do I continue operating in this capacity indefinitely, or is this a one-time assignment?" Admiral Harrison's smile carried the weight of someone who had spent years managing assets, whose capabilities made them simultaneously invaluable and dangerous to the organizations that employed them. "Lieutenant Commander, people with your qualifications don't retire to conventional assignments. Success in this mission would confirm your suitability for permanent assignment to programs that officially don't exist but serve critical national security functions." Morrison realized he was witnessing someone contemplate a decision that would fundamentally alter not just her military career, but her entire relationship with reality as most people understood it. Lieutenant Commander Reeves walked to the porthole overlooking the Pacific Ocean, her silhouette framed against the endless expanse of blue water that had served as humanity's highway for exploration, commerce, and warfare for millennia. Morrison found himself studying her reflection in the reinforced glass, seeing someone who carried the weight of decisions that most people never contemplated and responsibilities that extended far beyond individual survival. 72 hours ago, I was flying routine training missions and looking forward to a normal career progression through conventional naval aviation assignments," Nightfall said, her voice carrying a thoughtful quality that Morrison hadn't heard since her arrival. "Now I'm being asked to undertake a mission that could save the lives of innocent people while potentially sacrificing my own life and definitely surrendering any possibility of a normal future." Admiral Harrison remained silent, understanding that some decisions required individuals to work through the personal and professional implications without external pressure or artificial time constraints. Morrison found himself holding his breath as he watched someone contemplate choices that would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the lives of hundreds of innocent civilians whose only crime had been boarding an aircraft that became a target of hostile intelligence operations. The people on that aircraft didn't choose to become pawns in whatever game their captors are playing, Nightfall continued, her reflection showing someone who was processing moral obligations alongside tactical considerations. They were probably traveling for business, visiting family, or taking vacations that represented months of planning and saving. Now they're facing interrogation, torture, and possible execution because they happened to be in the wrong place when hostile actors decided to make a strategic move. Morrison realized he was listening to someone work through the ethical calculations that separated individuals who served their country's interests from those who served their own. The mission wasn't just about tactical success or strategic objectives. It was about the fundamental question of whether someone with exceptional capabilities had moral obligations that extended beyond personal safety and career advancement. "Admiral," Nightfall said, turning from the porthole to face the assembled officers and civilian observers, "I need you to understand something about my decision. I'm not accepting this mission because I believe in the political objectives it serves or because I trust the people who are asking me to undertake it. I'm accepting it because there are innocent people whose lives depend on someone being willing to take risks that most rational people would consider suicidal." Admiral Harrison nodded with the kind of professional respect that Morrison associated with recognition between individuals who had learned that some situations required personal sacrifice in service of principles that transcended institutional loyalty or individual ambition. "When do I leave?" Nightfall asked, her voice carrying the finality of someone who had made an irrevocable decision and was ready to face whatever consequences it might bring.